When people imagine gladiators in ancient Rome, they usually picture roaring crowds, flashing swords, and dramatic deaths in the Colosseum. What is less often imagined is what happened to gladiators outside the arena, after defeat, after death, or after disgrace. The phrase "gladiators buried alive" sounds sensational, and in some ways it is. There is no single Roman law that states gladiators were routinely buried alive as a standard practice. Yet when we examine Roman punishment rituals, religious customs, archaeological discoveries, and ancient texts together, a darker and more complex picture emerges. In certain circumstances, human beings connected to gladiatorial culture were indeed buried alive, either as punishment, ritual sacrifice, or symbolic exclusion from society. Understanding this requires stepping into the Roman mindset, where death, justice, religion, and spectacle were deeply intertwined. Gladiators occupied a strange position in Roman society. They were admired and despised at the same time. On one hand, they were celebrities. Graffiti across cities like Pompeii records fans praising individual fighters, especially successful ones, and even noble women were rumored to be infatuated with them. On the other hand, gladiators were legally classified as infames, people without honor. They could not vote, could not hold office, and were excluded from normal civic respect. Most gladiators were enslaved men, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to the arena, although by the 1st century AD, a noticeable minority were free volunteers seeking money or fame. Regardless of origin, once someone became a gladiator, their body no longer fully belonged to themselves. It belonged to the state, the lanista who owned them, and ultimately to Roman spectacle. The Romans were extremely concerned with how people died and how they were buried. Proper burial was not just a social expectation, but a religious necessity. A person who was not buried correctly could become a restless spirit, a lemur or larva, haunting the living. This belief applied even to criminals and slaves. However, certain punishments deliberately denied burial or used burial itself as a form of execution. Being buried alive was considered one of the most severe and symbolically powerful penalties in Roman culture. It was not used casually. It was reserved for crimes that were seen as contaminating the state, offending the gods, or violating the moral fabric of Rome. One of the clearest and best documented examples of live burial in Roman history involves the Vestal Virgins. Vestals were priestesses tasked with maintaining the sacred fire of Vesta, which symbolized Rome's survival. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, she was not executed openly. Roman law forbade the direct killing of a Vestal, so instead, she was buried alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water. This was seen as a religious necessity rather than a legal execution. The Romans believed this avoided the pollution of spilling sacred blood while still removing the offender from the world of the living. This precedent matters because it shows that live burial was an accepted and ritualized practice under specific conditions. Gladiators, while not religious figures like Vestals, were still deeply connected to ritual. Gladiatorial games originated as funeral rites, munera, held to honor the dead. Early games were performed at grave sites, where bloodshed was believed to appease the spirits of the deceased. Even centuries later, Roman writers remembered this origin. Death in the arena was never just entertainment. It was a ritual act tied to Roman ideas about death, honor, and sacrifice. This connection between death and ritual helps explain why some forms of execution associated with gladiators took on symbolic, even ceremonial, characteristics. Not all gladiators fought as equals in the arena. Some condemned criminals, known as damnati ad gladium or damnati ad bestias, were sent to die as part of the games. These individuals were not trained gladiators, but prisoners sentenced to death. They might be forced to fight armed professionals or face wild animals. Their deaths were meant to demonstrate Roman justice and power. In these cases, burial was often denied or handled with minimal respect. Some bodies were thrown into mass graves, while others were left for animals or disposed of quickly. Archaeological sites outside Rome and in provincial cities show evidence of hurried burials for arena victims, often without grave goods or markers. This is where the idea of buried alive begins to blur between literal execution and symbolic exclusion. In some instances, individuals connected to gladiatorial punishment were placed into pits, sealed chambers, or underground spaces as part of their sentence. Ancient sources describe certain executions where criminals were confined in enclosed spaces until death, especially during times of crisis when Rome believed the gods demanded expiation. Livy records that during periods of military disaster or plague, Rome resorted to extreme rituals, including burying people alive, sometimes foreigners or criminals, to appease divine anger. These victims were not always gladiators, but gladiators and condemned fighters were among the most expendable groups available. There is also evidence that some defeated or disgraced gladiators suffered ritualized deaths outside the arena. A gladiator who committed serious offenses, such as attacking a lanista, attempting escape repeatedly, or refusing to fight, could face severe punishment. While most punishments involve flogging, rebranding, or execution, some ancient accounts hint at confinement-based deaths. Roman prisons were brutal, underground, and poorly ventilated. A person locked inside could die slowly from starvation or suffocation. While technically not labeled as burial, the experience was functionally similar, being sealed away beneath the earth until death. Archaeological evidence adds another layer to this story. Excavations in places like Ephesus, York, and Pompeii have uncovered gladiator burial grounds that show careful organization for some fighters and shocking neglect for others. In York, for example, archaeologists found a cemetery containing decapitated male skeletons believed to be gladiators or executed criminals. Some skulls showed bite marks from large cats, confirming arena deaths. Other bodies were buried face down or in unusual positions, which in Roman culture often signified disgrace or punishment. While these individuals were not necessarily buried alive, the manner of burial suggests they were denied the dignity normally afforded even to the dead. One particularly disturbing category involves mass graves discovered near amphitheaters. In several Roman cities, pits filled with human remains have been identified, often lacking signs of coffins or formal burial rites. Some skeletons show no obvious trauma, raising the possibility that death occurred through confinement, suffocation, or neglect rather than combat. Scholars debate these findings, but they align with textual evidence that Rome sometimes used starvation or entombment as punishment. If a condemned individual was sealed in a pit or underground chamber and left to die, Roman authors might not describe it explicitly as burial alive, but the reality would have been horrifyingly similar. The religious dimension cannot be ignored. Romans believed that blood sacrifice had power, but so did removal from the world of the living. In certain rituals, especially during times of perceived divine anger, the state sought to symbolically bury pollution. Gladiators, criminals, and slaves were ideal candidates for such rituals because they existed on the margins of society. Pliny the Elder mentions that human sacrifice, while officially condemned in later periods, persisted in secret or symbolic forms well into the imperial era. Live burial, as a bloodless sacrifice, fit this pattern. There is also the question of gladiator funerals. Successful gladiators sometimes received elaborate burials funded by their collegia, associations formed to ensure proper funerary rites. Tombstones for gladiators survive, listing names, fighting styles, number of victories, and age at death. These inscriptions show that gladiators cared deeply about burial and remembrance. The fear of being denied burial was real. This fear would have been especially powerful for those condemned outside the normal rules of the arena. Being buried alive or sealed away would not just kill the body, but annihilate the soul's place in the afterlife, according to Roman belief. Ancient literature reinforces this fear. Seneca, in his letters, criticizes Roman cruelty and describes executions designed to humiliate and terrify. He writes about men being killed in ways meant to strip them of dignity, including prolonged confinement and staged deaths. While Seneca does not explicitly describe gladiators buried alive, his descriptions of execution culture make it clear that Roman justice prioritized spectacle and symbolism over mercy. The line between execution, ritual, and entertainment was thin. It is important to address exaggeration and myth. No surviving Roman law code states that gladiators were routinely buried alive as a standard penalty. Most gladiators who died did so in the arena or from injuries sustained there. Many were cremated or buried according to local custom. However, the Roman world was vast and practices varied by time and place. In provincial cities, local magistrates sometimes adopted extreme measures during crises, borrowing from older religious traditions. In these contexts, gladiators or condemned fighters could become victims of live burial or entombment, not because they were gladiators, but because they were expendable. The psychological impact of such punishments was part of their purpose. Rome ruled through fear as much as law. The knowledge that certain crimes could result in being sealed underground, cut off from light, air, and society, was meant to deter disobedience. For gladiators, who already lived with constant proximity to death, this added another layer of terror. Death in the arena at least offered a chance for courage, applause, and memory. Death by burial erased all of that. Modern historians must rely on fragments, texts written by elites, bones pulled from the earth, inscriptions weathered by time. From these fragments, a picture emerges that is less sensational than some myths, but more disturbing in its own way. Gladiators were not universally buried alive, but Roman society absolutely accepted live burial as a legitimate punishment and ritual act. Gladiators, criminals, and slaves existed within the category of people to whom such punishments could be applied under certain conditions. The idea of gladiators buried alive, then, is not a simple yes or no question. It is a window into how Rome viewed human life, social hierarchy, and the relationship between violence and order. In a world where public death was entertainment and religious duty, the boundary between killing and burying, between punishment and ritual, was often blurred. Gladiators stood at the center of this boundary, admired for their bravery and despised for their status. What makes this topic so unsettling is not just the possibility of live burial, but what it reveals about Roman values. The same society that built aqueducts, roads, and legal systems also devised punishments meant to erase people from both the living world and the memory of the dead. Gladiators, despite their fame, were never fully safe from this erasure. Their bodies could be celebrated or discarded, honored or hidden beneath the earth. When we think of ancient Rome, it is tempting to romanticize its grandeur or focus solely on its brutality. The truth lies somewhere in between. Gladiators buried alive, whether literally in sealed chambers or symbolically through denial of burial and remembrance, represent the extreme edge of Roman power. They remind us that behind the marble statues and epic histories was a society willing to sacrifice human beings to maintain order, appease gods, and entertain the masses. In the end, the story is not just about gladiators or burial. It is about how civilizations justify cruelty, how fear is woven into systems of control, and how the past continues to challenge our assumptions about progress. The earth of ancient Rome still holds its secrets, and among them are the silent stories of those who disappeared underground, not as heroes of the arena, but as victims of a world where being buried alive was sometimes considered acceptable, necessary, and even sacred.